you out there, everyone. Hello. Nicole and I have been watching what's happening in our global society through this pandemic. And because we've both had a near-death experience and studied the research on NDEs, we recognise that our current global experience is in fact akin to a near-death experience, but on a global scale. And I think would you agree with that, Nicole?
There's definitely a near-death experience taking place, a global scale. Something is ending and something is transforming and shifting. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I thought, Nicole, today, because we're going to be talking about our planetary near-death experience, it might be an idea if you begin with a brief description of what an NDE is, a near-death experience is, and then so we can understand a little bit more how we might be able to relate it to our current situation.
Absolutely. So you may have heard of the term a near-death experience. It's been around for a few decades now, I believe coined by Dr. Raymond Moody. And it's a phenomena where when somebody, let's go with the medical side, because that's where the science is more based in it, and the skeptics enjoy that conversation more. So when someone has a death experience, they're say having a heart attack or they're flatlining in some way in a hospital, the phenomena that we refer to as a near-death experience is when the physical body is going through, it's dying and it's on its way to death, or it does actually die, insofar as the hospital monitors record it as dying dead. But consciousness of that person has another experience. And then the person is revived in some way, and then they come back and they're able to talk about the experiences that their consciousness had. So that would be a classic near-death experience. There are also things that people would also call near-death experiences where their own life has been in danger in some way, but they might not have been in a hospital where the hospital is able to verify that they might have died or not. So, mine was by drowning, for example, but there was nothing medical at the time to say that. So there are other people that have those types of experiences, and then there's another gradient of them, which is near-death-like experiences, where it's like the ego, the sense of self, experiences itself as dying in some way. But what all three of those have in common is consciousness has an experience of some sort that is different to what the physical body is going through. There are many themes in terms of what can happen. So the typical ones I'm sure you would have heard of, and Hollywood plays on this with the movies, is I saw the light. So people might see a light of some sort. People might see loved ones. People might cross a threshold of some sort where they have to go, and they have a sense of, if I go past this threshold, I might not come back. I might not return. Maybe they have a choice in the matter. They get to choose whether they come back or not. And some people have the most extraordinary experience. Well, that's already extraordinary, but others will talk about certain realms that they might go to. So from more of a Western perspective, people will say heaven, I visited heaven, or a heaven-like realm. Again, there are cross-cultural implications. So people from different cultures will report different things. People might meet holy beings along the way. And one of the great outcomes that can come from these experiences is a reevaluation, or sometimes a complete shift in personal values. So people might get a sense of people usually do get a sense of what's really important to them, have a sense of gratitude of, I have another chance at being back and being in the body. So there's many things that can happen leading up to the experience, within the experience itself, and of course, both the short-term after effects and long-term after effects. So in a nutshell, a near-death experience is something where the body is going through its own physical end, and yet consciousness has some other experience that is able, well, it has another experience that's different from what the physical body is going through.
Mm. And how this relates to our current situation with this pandemic is that you don't have to come close to death or physical death. You can have an emotional crisis. And this is where I find really interesting that the near-death experience researchers are expanding their understanding of that to a whole host of other types of experiences can have the same after effects. And some of those can be like, some of the markers of they'll endure high stress. They can be under very high duress for a chronic period of time as well. And they can have like a life review. And I think we're all going through a life review at the moment, aren't we? We're reevaluating, my life is, I've done this so far, like what do I really want to keep doing these sorts of things? And so we're going through that too. And one of the other ongoing effects, which I find really interesting, is there's a sense of a connectedness, a oneness with everything. And it's like the experience touches people really deeply. So it becomes, in effect, a transformational experience and a spiritually transformational experience too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's another one of those great themes, the life preview, and for some even the life review, the review, and for some the preview. And absolutely, because of this collective situation we all find ourselves in, this extraordinary situation in the globe, we're on pause. And it's like that between birthing moments. I mean, we've just had the Easter Passover weekend, and so for many, they're celebrating that rebirthing moment. And of course, to rebirth, before the birth comes, something has to die, something has to pass away. So in previous conversations we've had too, Sheryl, we were talking about grief. That grief is really tied up with acknowledging the end to something that we have known up until this point, and all of the thoughts and emotions that come up around that. So in a collective near-death-like experience, which is one metaphor for what is going on right now, grief is absolutely a part of that, because something is ending. And then as we sit in that middle canal before the rebirthing experience, that big pregnant pause in between, where we are back into the field of all possibility. We are reconnecting back to our infinite nature from that place. And so anything can happen from here. This is really fascinating. Now, in an individual near-death experience, of course, you can go and have these adventures. But in the collective one, it has a different flavor, because these are many minds, these are billions of minds coming together and sharing this experience. So it brings something different yet again. And definitely in that pregnant pause moment, we can look backwards and do the life review. Where have I been? What have I been doing? What was great about that, and what was not so great about that? What do I want to be done with? Thank you very much. And that's on the personal level. And then on the collective level, that whole conversation around essentials and non-essentials, well, that very much taps into that base of looking previously into some of the things that are just peripheral and nonsense that we really don't need. Yes, there's been a lot of grief around people losing jobs, and yet at the same time, we know that about 80 to 85 to 90% of people have been miserable in their jobs as well. And so when you look at all of the stress and the trauma and the grief that is around, that was already existing there, to not be having a lot of that, but then experiencing stress on other levels for many people around, they're not having the income, and it's a different type of stress, right? You might not have the boss that you don't like not barking at you anymore, but now you have a different type of stressor. But that pregnant pause now, where we can look and, okay, yes, that was what it was. And we can be in the moment before we do the life review, the life preview now. What do we want it to be? What's coming forward, right? Like the movie previews. We can look into, well, what do I want to be different within that? If I don't want to have a boss barking at me, okay, then what am I going to do differently? How do I want to be differently? Am I going to go back to that type of scenario? Will that scenario be there? If it won't, how do I want to live differently? How can the world live differently? So it is this moment where we can have a collective dreaming that's going on now too. And I'm not talking about, you know, rainbows and fairies and unicorns. It's like, this is solid. This is our earth experience that is very grounded. And so we are in this, we're always in the field of infinite potential. We're always in it. But it's even more potent right now, because if we go with this idea of the near-death experience, we're in the pregnant pause. So it's just being highlighted to us that we have the opportunity that we can not only create, but we can co-create to shift into something much better.
Actually,
I hope we will.
well, that's really interesting that you mentioned a pregnant pause, because I think from memory, PMA Chatwater said in one of her books, and I think it was Near-Death Experiences, The Rest of the Story, that she talks about that a near-death experience can be something like a, what does she call it? A colloidal condition. And she likened it to where if you've got a bucket of water and you're stirring it and it creates that vortex in the water, and then you start stirring it in the opposite direction, it's that moment in time where the water is neither going one way or the other. It is just a pregnant pause in the moment of that water's movement before it actually changes, changes direction. And I find that really interesting, because in that moment, for me, that's the moment between heartbeats, between breaths. You know, it's like, wow, there's so much potential here that things can happen. And I know Paladin Jenkins, who I think he was a crop circle researcher at one stage, he's doing all sorts of things now. He was here in Brisbane in 1992 at a conference that I was at, and he talks about near-death experiences as a soul quake, so that you're rocked to your very soul, and in that it's a bit like cracking it open, I think, because in that all sorts of things that haven't been expressed to that point perhaps then have the potential to come out, and we can run with it. So I think that's what's going on the planet. And I have to point out that not everyone who comes close to death or has an emotional crisis will have these sort of experiences. They don't accompany everyone. In fact, I think some of the figures I've read, it's about 25% of people who come, and that's one of the higher studies, people who come close to death or have these emotional crises, only about 25% of people will be affected in this way. Why that is, I have theories, and perhaps we'll get onto that. I don't know, but it's like on PMA Chatwater also talks about, like, people have a brain shift and a spirit shift, you know. So there's an awakening experience for the potential for human evolution to go forward from that point.
And that is what is so exciting, that this is a collective experience right now. We can tap into the wisdom of the near-death experience community and what they've been saying for a long time. There's some pretty consistent messages that have come through from that community that is now in the tens of thousands. But we're in it together right now. Like, we're really in it together, and we don't actually know how long this is going to last. Yeah.
And I was also looking at some, like, we've been through situations like this before that have had major changes afterwards. And I pulled out 4 experiences, and one goes back to the 1340s with the Black Death, which affected people in Eurasia, North Africa, and Europe. And that was an estimated 75 to 200 million people who died. But from that, they had profound religious, social, and economic upheavals, causing a historic shift toward the modern world. Another example was the 1755 Lisbon earthquake in Portugal. They had 60,000 killed, but it sparked the European Enlightenment. And in 1976, there was the Tangshan earthquake, and there were 242,000 people killed. Some said it was maybe 3 times more than that, and maybe about 700,000. But it rocked the seat of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing and ended the Maoist era in China. And the other one, of course, that we're all familiar with is the 2001 terrorist attack in the USA. And that killed 3,000 people. But interestingly, British scientists analysed the suicide rates in England and Wales at the time, and they found they dropped by 40%. So there's some remarkable changes that come around through crisis. And I've been wondering, is this really a biological imperative that the human species needs from time to time to kick us up the backside and move us forward? What do you think?
Perhaps. Perhaps it is. And certainly if there are patterns that are repeated in human behavior, then I would agree that there's some kind of a reason for that. Now, we obviously aren't consciously trying to kill ourselves for the most part. And so if that is so, it would be a pretty unconscious pattern that is playing out again and again. However, having said that, we're very consciously aware of the climate crisis, and that is that's just sitting on a time bomb as well, heading into collective suicide as a species. And it's a pretty dire thing, but I've always felt, look, if we can't take care of ourselves as a species, and if we can't learn to be good custodians of this planet's going to be fine without us. We won't be fine without it. But, planet Earth, Mother Earth, Pachamama, however you would like to refer to this living, amazing entity that is a big rock hurtling through space, doesn't need us. And so we have to learn to do something differently. And it's so interesting that this has come now. There's a fellow transpersonal researcher here in Australia, Dr. Kylie Harris, who has it, and I'm sure she won't mind me sharing this, but has an idea that in some ways this pandemic that came forward is like the precursor, or in some ways the preview to a longer big crisis that was really already on its way with the climate crisis. And perhaps this is a practice run, to get it right now, and that we're actually, by going through this clearing in many ways now, we're avoiding a larger catastrophe down the road. And so isn't it interesting that the Earth is doing really well right now without us, now that we've all just scuttled back into our little caves. This parasitic species, which is what we have been, that's how we've been behaving on this planet. We've been very bad. We've been behaving very badly. And as we have crawled into our holes for a bit, the planet is doing just fine. And if we humans were to disappear like that, it'd be a remarkable planet. I mean, this place would recover in no time. So, we have a choice right now as humans, and this again comes back to that near-death experience. When someone goes through a near-death experience, at its essence, you're questioning existence, to live or not to live. And if I live, why should I live? What is it about living that makes it worth doing, that makes it important, and why would I want to stay? And many people, I worked on a suicide hotline for quite some time, and that was the training that we got at that point. When that person calls up, and you'll probably never speak to that person again, and you don't know if that conversation is the last conversation that person will ever have. It's quite a bit of pressure. The conversation that we're trained to have with them is to weigh up your reasons to stay and your reasons to leave. So to validate that they have reasons to leave, because, they've come to that point where that seems like the best choice forward. And there are commonalities with the near-death experience, whether it be personal or collective, in we do the same weighing up of values. What are my reasons to stay? What makes life valuable? What makes this human existence valuable? And what can go? right? So people who have the very dramatic near-death experience have that experience put upon them. They don't consciously choose the near-death experience. So they go through it, they have the choice points, etc. Some of them have the choice points. But the values are reevaluated. Either, you know, they remember doing that through the experience, or they come out of a near-death or near-death-like experience and naturally go through some kind of a personal re-evaluation of what's truly important or not. And that's beautiful that we're doing that as a species right now, with this whole, you know, potential end of the species and the climate conversation looming right there. It's this pause point just beforehand to say what's truly important. If we're going to make it through as a species, and if we're going to elevate our behavior to actually being good, even outstanding custodians of this planet that we are gifted to be living on, that supports everything about our life force, everything. If we are to truly honor it, how can we do that better? And then if we look back now and do the review, there's a whole heap of that stuff that just isn't going to cut it anymore. So now what? You know, and this becomes a really challenging part, the now what, in the journey of someone who goes through a near-death experience. It's the integration of the two worlds, because you get to a point where you can acknowledge there are two different modes of being. There's what I either ideally see I'd like, or for the near-death experience that they've already experienced what might be termed heaven or a heaven-like realm, or an ideal way of being, right? Something that is so incredibly pure and beautiful and awesome. And I'll put in a little asterisk there to say not every near-death experiencer has a pleasant experience. There are many who don't, and I fully want to acknowledge that, because that's a very important conversation too. So there is something that is seen there of the possibility. And again, that's why it's so interesting that we're in a collective experience and we are awake right now. We are conscious to this experience we are experiencing, which means we get choice. We get choice in the matter. That's what makes it thrilling. So we get choice to evaluate and to dream about what we want to bring into being, knowing where we've been and what has worked and what has not worked. And if that means radically changing some things that you do in your life, maybe it's time to do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it's something that we all have to decide for ourselves, regardless of what authorities say. This is where we have that choice point where we decide, will we or won't we? And that's so important, I think, for people particularly who accept that we may have existence past this, in some way, past this physical body, which can have a very powerful impact on the future of our soul, the choices that we make now. But, you know, the choices that we make for the planet too now. And by the planet, I mean all living things, including the planet, but all life on planet Earth, and that's life with a capital L too. So while you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, our ancestors have been through these things before, and they've had great changes. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is epigenetics, and how these type of experiences change the expression of our genes, and somehow they are then passed on. The effects of what we're going through right now will be passed on into our genes to our progeny, to our descendants. Not mine, I've had my children, but, you know, for other people who are going through this, who are yet to have a family, this will be passed on. And then that made me wonder about things that have happened in the past and how those experiences may have affected our great-grandmothers, for example, and our great-grandfathers. For example, World War II. You know, there were studies done on people who'd been through those sorts of experiences, and how they either suffered from something which researchers hadn't found they had previously, but as an after effect of their experience. So, like you said before, not everyone has a pleasant near-death experience, and some people, those experiences can rattle around inside them for a very long time until they can resolve and integrate them. And I see that as what's going to happen with humanity now, that this pandemic, acting as a near-death experience for many, many people, is going to rattle around inside people the emotional and physical content, because stress creates physical problems too. It's going to rattle around inside people for a very long time until they can integrate and resolve, come to terms with, stand and face up to what they've had to let go of, to be able to move through the experience.
Yeah, agreed, absolutely. And I think one of the things that can help with integration is understanding that we can process who we are through different layers of our being. So, we have the most densest, which is our physical form, and then we have our emotional realm, and then we have our thought realm, and then we have, this spiritual or soul realm, and something that is very, finite, infinite as well. And so right now, I suspect the vast majority of people are focused on the physical, the emotional, the mental. And that can just be this catastrophic blend of all kinds of things. Physically, especially when your power is stripped away from you. Power is so important in this conversation right now, because we are having ways of being enforced upon us. So many people are feeling a loss of personal power, whether they understand that or not. There's a loss of personal power because they don't get to do the things that normally give them a sense of autonomy and self-governance in their own life. You don't get to choose who you're hanging out with, when you're hanging out with them, for how long, where you're going for your livelihood. For not everybody, obviously, but there are many people in this situation. And that can cause a whole heap of rage, right? I mean, you take freedom away from a child and you look at what happens there, you get a temper tantrum. And so we're like, in many levels, if you're fully focused on that physical, emotional, it can be like a teenager having a big tantrum. You've just taken things away from me, and that's not fair. I don't like it. It's not fair. Yeah, right? So there's that's happening on one level. If you step and if you inhabit the emotional realm, if that's where you're at, it's governed by water. And so like water, it is incredibly fluid, and it can be hard to ground your feet in something solid, and you can be shifting, like thought realm as well. You can shift from here to there so quickly that you can lose yourself in the process. If it's the emotional realm, you can be so swayed by others and the emotions of others, and especially with the suffering, if you're turning the TV on and you have media at you at the moment, which is what the experiences is, you have this story playing out that is at you. Most of it is about human misery and suffering right now. So if you're an empath and you're tuned into that, that can be really painful right now, to be tuning into a collective suffering that's taking place. If you're in the mental realm, well, there's no shortage of theories and thoughts of what's happening right now, whether it's the front story of what we're being told or whether it's layers of any backstory. There's plenty of information to sink your mind into to understand what's going on. And it's the same thing if you're not grounded within your personal power and some layer of your body and your beingness on this planet and a strong sense of self, you can easily get lost down different rabbit holes. And so one area that people are shifting to, which I think can be very useful, is that bigger vision, your spiritual perspective, or the more of the etheric body, or standing back, essentially taking the eagle eye view on this planet and this earth and what's happening. And it can be useful to do that because it gives us a level of detachment from the mental, from the emotional, from the physical, to just take a breather. And not to hang out there purely also, because we can't always remain totally detached. We have to embody our human being in our form. But it's another perspective where if you just need to take a breather from all of it, if you're finding it overwhelming, that can be one way, just to step back and go, I am alive, I have breath, I am on this planet is okay. In fact, this planet's doing pretty well right now. Yes, we humans are suffering, and we've been through stuff like this before, and we're going to make it through it again. And of course, having metaphors on that level is very useful, as well as we're talking about here, the metaphor of either the near-death experience or the rebirthing. Those things can really help give us a sense of strength. And for some people, they have a connection to what they might call creator, zero force, whatever your word is that you want to use there, that can also fill you up again with a sense of power and being empowered, but not one that is far removed, one that still needs to come into your body and through you so that you feel personally empowered. And I think it's also important that we check in on all of those levels with ourselves. We understand what's happening in our, on all of those. Where is my mind at? Where's it fitting in with? Where are my emotions at? Physically, how am I feeling? How am I taking care and maintaining this being at this time? As we do that, that is all going to help with the integration process, because this can get pretty complicated. This can get a little frightening. For some, it's going to get terrifying. And so the more we can just ground in our beings and feel very solid in ourselves, the better we'll pull through this.
Yes, very true, Nicole, very true. I'm wondering, while you're talking, I've heard of these sorts of experiences where we're in emotional crisis as blessed unrest experiences, where they enter our lives in a way, and I guess, and I have to say this because I'm doing an astrology update with an astrologer, that this is a generational thing. There's everyone on the planet it's happening to, but it has the potential to create space for divinity to enter. And I say that because you mentioned, spiritual attitudes, and we both do spiritual attitudes and beliefs. Most of the time, our heads are just so full of stuff, and our lives are so full of stuff that, the spirituality, and people talk about spirituality, but do they actually practice it? Do they actually make time for it in their lives? So we're in a time of crisis. This is where I think they probably got the idea of it, calling it a blessed unrest, because it creates like a potentiation of something like this to crack us open, to open ourselves to higher inspiration, to listening to guidance, which basically most people don't do they?
And I suspect, well, I think many might, but might not share about that or talk about it. And many will not use the term spirituality or spirit as well. Yeah.
That could be instinctual intuition too, which is really basically wired into our physiology, isn't it? So we have the survival things. But I know many people who will say to me, "Oh, a little voice inside said don't do that, but I still did it." And I've had those experiences myself. So I don't know anyone who hasn't had that experience, but that slowing down, that listening to that inner still voice within, that if we did pay attention to it, would guide us better in our lives. So, and through this collapse anxiety that we're going through, really, basically, that everyone's got this. And before this was all happening, I was talking about the environment. I was talking about annihilation alarm. That was what I was calling it. But, annihilation alarm, collapse anxiety, it stirs something in people, like going back to the near-death experience, that not everyone will respond to. Like we said, not everyone who has these emotional crises and an NDE will respond in that way. But there will be a percentage of the population that will. And I think that they are probably what will go on or have started to already, but this has really enhanced it. They're our change makers and our cultural creatives in society that bring things together in ways that you wouldn't ordinarily think of and create those changes in a more profound and out of the box sort of way.
And they're ready to go right now. They've done the work. They've done the self-work. They've processed their traumas. They have dived into their shadow stuff. I mean, they get it. They've been there. They're like, yeah, this is what we've been talking about and waiting for. Here it is. Let's go. What's next? So there's a whole community of people right now who are jumping right on. They're not being complacent. And I think that term blessed unrest is such a lovely one, because there is something still very unsettling about these times. We are not at peace with ourselves as a species. There is a crisis going on. At least that is the major narrative that is being told right now. So we're in a narrative of crisis, which naturally it triggers things in people when you're in crisis, right? You have to respond to that. So we have our first responders who are doing something, and then we have this latent population who are being told to stay still. That is highly unsettling, because it's hard to sit still when you understand something's wrong. If we have a loved one and they're going through some level of suffering, it's natural and normal to want to get up off your ass and do something about it. You want to be useful. And when you're told not to do that, it goes against our natural caring instinct that we have. That's a beautiful attribute that we have as human beings, our compassion. And so we're having to find other ways right now, and that's where our innovation and creativity is coming in. And it's brilliant, because we've also been very clever as a species to find technology like this, to create technology. I mean, we've done what the mushrooms and the fungi have done, right? I mean, they're the original creators of the internet under the earth. And we have it, our brains look the same as that, and we've manifested it out in this thing called the internet so that we can communicate to each other in this way. And we now have this tool. So these are all brilliant attributes of our collective creative side, and being in the blessed unrest means if we can tolerate it, this period, and we can also use it as an opportunity to really harness some of our brilliance and our genius as a species to rise to something much better. I don't think there's many people who would disagree. There's probably not so many people, I think, who wouldn't disagree that the way we've been doing things has really, that we could do better. You know, we could take care of each other better. We could do finances better. We could do relationships better. There's so much about the way we've been traveling up until this point that's been pretty broken, and we've just kind of hobbled along. And there's been a lot of casualties that have dropped off along the way out of pure misery. And that's not a way to live either. We don't have to do that.
Yeah. And these, transformative experiences help us remember what we've forgotten. We know to do better, but we push it aside. And the more we push it aside, the more it goes into past memory, doesn't it? forget about it, so that it becomes this way of doing things which is not up to spec, and we know it unconsciously, and sometimes consciously it comes to the fore too. You know, these experiences, and I'm hoping that's what happens through this pandemic and on the other side of it, that people are remembering these things, that to treat each other better, to have a better moral and ethics, to to treat the elderly and the children better, and the animals, and the environment, and stop polluting and all that. And we know those sorts of things. Make better choices when we buy things, all those sorts of things. So, but we just get so busy and so caught up with everything, we just push it to the side and just forget it. And this is a real opportunity, like you said before, for us to remember those things and to make the choice to behave differently in the future.
And I think we also live by convenience. So because we've become so busy in our modern lives, we lean on the crutch of convenience. So whatever's quick and easy, that will be our go-to. And so what we've seen is, a loss of small businesses, and a leaning on the big supermarkets and, the big chains, right? Now, is there a scheme in place to make more of that happen anyway? That's another whole conversation in itself. Having said that, we as individuals have the choice, right? Consumer power in the end is going to win. And so that's why it's exciting that many of those people who have been on their path up until this point and who are ready to rise and play an even bigger role, they have this moment to step in, because what has so far been an alternative fringe could become new powerful modes of moving forward if they're presented to the people, and if people know that those choices are actually there. If you don't know that you have choices, you can't make a choice between things. And so that's why I'm so passionate about somehow getting people forward, so that they can have all of that wisdom and goodness that they've been working on or putting into product or service or whatever it is, to somehow bring that forward to the world and say there are other ways of doing this. You don't have to necessarily take that to have that outcome. You could do this, which is going to be much better for you, and have an even better outcome that way. But again, in our busyness, we don't know that, and we default. And that's no fault of anyone's. No one should feel guilty about that. And you can wake up to the fact that there's more out there. There's more time now to check things out and be open to some alternatives. And if you know for yourself something hasn't been working, it hasn't been right, and you want to transform, this is a perfect time. This is a perfect time to do it. When would it be a more perfect time than now? What on earth are you waiting for if now is not a time to make some changes?
Absolutely. We've had a lot of rehearsals in our life about how to get it right, but this is the time. This is the time to get that true maturity happening, and going forward from here. So that's our thoughts for today, everyone. So we hope you get something out of that. And Nicole and I will be back next.
I'm going to try and jump on the live comments here, Sheryl, and see if we can, if the live feed is working. There might be some questions or comments if I can figure out my technology.
Sure.
While you're chatting over your end.
That's okay. I was just going to say to everyone that next week we will be back on Wednesday, every Wednesday at 12 noon, as we talk our way through this pandemic and beyond, because it doesn't just finish with this. It's about what's waiting for us on the other side, isn't it? So we look forward to seeing you then. We do. I'm thoroughly enjoying this series. Keep some comments going. I'd love to create this into a dialogue way where, we hear from you guys as well, and things that you'd love us to address. I can't figure out the technology. Well, I can't multitask. So I'm just going to be present to this moment, and we'll have to check up on the comments on the side. But, all right. See you
much
next week.
love to everybody, and see you next week. Travel well.
Yeah.